The bus station at Millhaven Bend smelled like burnt coffee, diesel exhaust, and the deep dampness of a river town that had never quite dried out after its last flood. Rowan Callum stepped down from the Greyhound onto cracked pavement and stood for a moment beneath the flickering station light, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness beyond the parking lot. October wind came hard off the river. It carried pine resin, river mud, and the distant smell of wood smoke from somewhere up in the Ozark Hills. Rowan pulled the collar of her jacket higher and looked around slowly, as a woman does when she has learned to read places before trusting them. Millhaven Bend was the kind of town that existed mostly in the spaces between other towns. One main road running parallel to the river. A grain elevator near the water, dark and silent at this hour. A church with a white steeple barely visible against the clouded sky. Two diners, both closed. A hardware store with a hand-painted sign. A place where nothing moved quickly and nobody expected it to. Rex stood beside her on the pavement, three legs bearing weight evenly, the left front lifted slightly the way it always did when the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. The Belgian Malinois was 9 years old now, which was old for a working dog, and the cold reached his old injuries before it reached anything else. He stood perfectly still despite the pain, ears moving in small, careful arcs, reading the town the same way Rowan was reading it. Rowan reached down without looking and scratched behind the dog's left ear. Rex leaned into her hand for exactly 2 seconds, then straightened again, still watching. That was answer enough. The Greyhound pulled away behind them, its taillights disappearing down the wet highway toward Little Rock. Within a few minutes, the station parking lot was empty. Rowan and Rex stood alone beneath the buzzing fluorescent light while rain clouds gathered low over the Ozarks and the first cold drops began to fall. Rowan adjusted the military backpack on her shoulders and started walking. She had $14 in her wallet. She had Rex. She had the clothes on her back and a change of clothes inside the pack, and a folding knife she carried more from habit than intention. She had a VA card that was 3 years out of date and a driver's license from a state she no longer lived in. Everything else she had once owned was either sold, lost, or left behind in places she no longer thought about carefully. At 56, Rowan Callum looked older than her years in some ways and exactly her age in others. Her hair had gone silver at the temples and nearly white along the sides, cut short and practical. The lines carved into her face were deep, the kind that came not from age alone, but from sustained vigilance, from years of sleeping lightly in dangerous places and waking fast. Her shoulders still carried the broad frame of a woman who had once been physically exceptional. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were the problem. Her eyes never fully stopped working. They moved across rooms in patterns that other people found unsettling without quite understanding why. Entrances first, then blind spots, then the people nearest the exits. It had been useful overseas. It made grocery stores and waiting rooms and ordinary Tuesday afternoons feel like something they were not. She had been sleeping behind a warehouse outside Tulsa 3 months ago. Before that, a church shelter in Fayetteville. Before that, 2 weeks under an overpass outside Memphis, where she had lain awake listening to trucks thunder overhead all night while Rex slept pressed against her chest like a furnace, warm and steady and alive. Before all of that, there had been a house outside Pensacola with a screen porch and a ceiling fan that wobbled on the highest setting. A husband named Marcus, who made strong coffee and asked direct questions. A daughter named Nora, who had Rowan's eyes, and her father's way of standing with her arms crossed when she was thinking hard about something. That life existed now the way old photographs existed. You could look at them. You could recognize the people in them. But the distance between you and those people was a specific kind of distance that had no name. The marriage had ended quietly, not with screaming or betrayal, but with exhaustion. The long, slow exhaustion of a man who had tried to reach a woman who was never quite present in the room she occupied. Marcus had been patient longer than she deserved. When he finally asked her to leave, there was more sadness in his voice than anger, and somehow that was worse. Nora had been 25 at the time. She had called twice in the following year. Rowan had answered once and said the wrong things. Nora had stopped calling after that, and Rowan had not blamed her. She walked through the center of Millhaven Bend, with Rex moving quietly beside her, while rain began in earnest, soft and cold against her face. The main street was empty at this hour, except for a single truck idling outside a gas station and an old man walking a small dog beneath an umbrella on the opposite sidewalk. The old man watched Rowan and Rex pass without speaking. Rowan did not speak either. She passed a barber shop, a feed store, a small realty office with listings taped inside the darkened window. She passed a VFW hall with a flagpole out front and a light burning above the door. She slowed briefly outside the VFW, not because she was considering going in, but because the light above the door was warm and the rain was getting colder, and for just a moment she stood in the glow of it. Rex stopped beside her. After a moment, they both walked on. The river appeared at the end of the main road where the pavement gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to muddy ground sloping toward the water. The white river ran broad and black under the October sky, carrying the last of the season's leaves downstream in slow dark spirals. The far bank was lined with sycamore trees stripped bare by autumn, their white bark pale and skeletal against the dark hills beyond. The marina occupied a long stretch of bank just north of the road's end. It had once been a working marina, judging by the infrastructure. The covered slips, the crane lift frame rusted solid now, the fuel dock with pumps that looked decades out of service. Maybe 20 years ago it had smelled like boat engines and sunscreen and somebody's idea of a summer weekend. Now it smelled like river mud and rotting wood and the hollow smell of places that had been waiting for something that never came back. Half the slips stood empty. Several dock sections had partially collapsed into the water. A single sodium light on a tall pole threw orange illumination across the nearest portion of the dock, and in that light, Rowan could see the shapes of 3 or 4 old boats tied to whatever cleats still held. Rex stopped. His ears lifted and angled forward in a way Rowan had learned to take seriously a long time ago. Not alarm exactly, more like recognition of something invisible that demanded attention. Rowan followed the dog's gaze to the far end of the marina. The houseboat sat in the last slip, leaning slightly toward the dockside, as though exhausted by its own weight. The hull was streaked with rust that had bled down from every seam and fitting over what looked like many years of neglect. The cabin windows were filmed with grime thick enough to be opaque. One section of the roof had sagged inward where water had pooled and pulled at the structure until the structure yielded. A rope that might once have been a proper dock line had frayed into something closer to decoration. Along the stern, barely legible beneath layers of weathering and river stain, a name remained. River Judas. Rex started walking toward it immediately. Rowan said his name once, quietly. The dog did not slow down. They crossed the marina parking lot together, gravel crunching under Rowan's boots and Rex's 3 good paws, while rain ticked against aluminum dock covers, and somewhere a loose chain rattled against a cleat in the wind coming off the water. A voice came from the darkness near the marina office. "You planning to buy bait or just admire what's left of my dock?" Rowan stopped and looked toward the sound. A man sat beneath the narrow overhang of the marina office building on a folding chair, a coffee mug balanced on one knee and a cigarette burning between 2 fingers. He was perhaps 67 years old, with a white beard trimmed close and a canvas jacket stained with grease and what looked like epoxy resin. His eyes in the shadow of the overhang were sharp and patient, eyes that noticed things and waited for them to become clear before drawing conclusions. "Just passing through," Rowan said. The man looked at Rex. The dog had not stopped. He was nearly at the dock entrance now, moving with a focused, deliberate quality that had nothing casual about it. "That dog's not passing through," the man said. "That dog's going somewhere specific." Rowan watched Rex reach the dock and step carefully onto the wet boards, moving toward the houseboat at the far end with the same unhurried certainty he had shown approaching cleared buildings overseas. The man stood from his chair and walked over, extending one hand. "Everett Dooley. I own what's left of this place." Rowan shook it. "Rowan Callum." Everett looked at her steadily for a moment with the attention that older men who have spent time around the military develop, reading posture and bearing in the set of a jaw. "Navy," he said. "Not a question. Used to be." Everett nodded once as though that confirmed something he had already decided. He turned and looked toward Rex, who had reached the far dock and was now standing completely still on the listing deck of the houseboat, staring down at the boards beneath his feet. "That boat," Everett said, "belonged to a man named Cole Mercer. Lived on it near 60 years. Navy Korean War, came back and never could quite settle on land again. Bought this slip in 1961 and never left. He paused, drawing on his cigarette. Passed away last winter. Sat down in his chair one morning to watch the river and his heart just stopped. Found him there 3 days later, still facing the water. Rowan said nothing for a moment. What happened to his things? Everything's still on the boat. Nobody's touched it. Everett's voice carried something careful in it, something that suggested the situation was more complicated than a simple estate matter. Locals say the boat's cursed. He almost smiled. Locals say a lot of things in a town this size. They walked together down the dock toward Rex. The old boards groaned under their weight in ways that suggested they had been groaning for years and had developed opinions about it. Rain fell steadily now, dimpling the black surface of the river between the dock pilings. Rex stood on the deck of the River Judas without moving. His attention was entirely on the floorboards of the cabin entrance, his head lowered, ears forward, nostrils working in the small, rapid movements that Rowan associated with serious detection work rather than casual curiosity. Rowan stepped carefully onto the deck. The boat shifted under her, rocking against the dock with a low metallic groan. She crouched beside Rex and pressed one hand flat against the cabin floorboards. Cold wood, old wood, nothing that explained what the dog was doing. Rex had never been wrong about this kind of attention. 9 years, 2 deployments, 47 confirmed detection events, not a single false alert. Whatever he smelled beneath these boards, he smelled it clearly. Everett watched from the dock. Your dog always act like this. No, Rowan said. The old marina owner was quiet for a moment. You got somewhere to sleep tonight. Rowan looked back at him. Then she looked at the boat. Everett seemed to read what was happening in her expression with more accuracy than was entirely comfortable. He reached into his jacket pocket, found nothing useful there, and set the thought aside. Tell you what, he said, I need that boat gone before the winter floods pull the dock apart. Been meaning to cut her loose for months. His cigarette had burned down to his fingers and he dropped it on the wet dock without looking at it. You got $10. Rowan looked at him. $10, Everett repeated. You give me $10 and the boat is yours. He shrugged with the quality of a man who had thought about this moment more carefully than the shrug suggested. Figure a woman and her dog in the rain deserve somewhere dry to stand. Rowan reached into her jacket and pulled out her wallet. Inside it were $14. She had known the amount without needing to count it because when you have $14, you know exactly how many you have. She handed over a 10. Everett folded it once and put it in his pocket without ceremony. Guess you own a boat now, he said. Lightning moved somewhere distant over the Ozark ridgeline, illuminating the hills for one pale second before the thunder reached them, rolling low and long across the valley. Rex did not react to the thunder. He was still looking down at the boards beneath his feet. And in the moment this lightning faded, Rowan stood on the deck of a dying houseboat in a town she had arrived at by accident, with $14 reduced to $4, with a dog that was telling her something waited beneath the floor, and with a sensation that occasionally visited people who had stopped believing in direction, the sensation that a thing had begun. She did not trust the sensation. She had been wrong about it before, but Rex had not. The inside of the cabin was worse than the outside suggested, and the outside had not suggested anything optimistic. Rowan pulled the door open and the hinges registered their objection loudly. The smell that came out was layered and specific. River damp at the base of it, then mildew, then old wood releasing moisture it had been holding for years, and beneath all of that, something else, something that took Rowan a moment to place. Machine oil, old metal, the smell of equipment that had been carefully maintained for a long time and then left alone. She stepped inside. The floor shifted slightly under her weight in a way that was not structural failure, but simple age, wood that had learned to move with the river and had not unlearned it. Rex followed her in and immediately began moving through the cabin in the careful pattern Rowan recognized from building clearances. Corner to corner, nose low, then rising, tracking invisible gradients in the air. The cabin was small, a narrow bunk against one wall under a window so filmed with grime it had become translucent rather than transparent. A tiny propane stove bolted to a counter beside a sink where the faucet had been wrapped in electrical tape against some old leak. Cabinets with warped doors that would not quite close. a rusted chair positioned near the forward window, angled toward the river. On the small shelf above the bunk, a row of composition notebooks stood wedged between two coffee cans filled with river stones. A photograph was pinned to the wall beside them, black and white, slightly water-stained at one corner. Two figures standing beside what looked like a patrol boat on a rocky shoreline, sunlight harsh and flattening in the way of field photographs taken without planning. One figure was a young man, shirtless, squinting against the light. Beside him, a dog sat at attention, ears fully erect, looking directly at the camera with the focused composure of a working animal that understood its purpose. The man in the photograph was perhaps 20 years old. The dog was a German shepherd with a deep chest and alert, intelligent eyes. Rowan looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she looked at Rex, who had stopped in the center of the cabin floor directly above what she could now see. Looking more carefully, was a recessed hatch set into the boards. A bilge access, common on riverboats, but this one had been modified. The original hatch cover had been replaced with something heavier, a section of planking that matched the surrounding floor well enough to be unnoticeable at a casual glance, but that showed, on close examination, slightly different grain orientation than the boards on either side of it. Someone had made it look like floor. Rex sat down beside it. He looked up at Rowan once with the expression she had come to think of as his professional face, clear-eyed, steady, certain. Then he looked back down at the hatch. The rain intensified outside. It hammered the roof in long, sweeping surges as the wind pushed it in waves off the river. Lightning moved closer now, the intervals between flash and thunder shortening. The marina outside groaned and rattled and knocked in the storm, making all the sounds of things under pressure that had learned to endure it. Everett appeared in the doorway, carrying a kerosene lantern already lit against the failing light. "Power's been unreliable on this end of the dock since August," he said. "Generators outside by the fuel drum if you want to try it." He set the lantern on the counter and looked around the cabin with the expression of a man who had seen it many times and still had not entirely made peace with it. Cole kept it clean. His voice was different when he said it, quieter. He was particular about things, always had the right tool for whatever needed doing, never wasted emotion. He was looking at the rusted chair by the window. Used to see him there every morning before I opened up. Coffee in one hand, river in the other. His paws carried the weight of something he had returned to many times. Never understood how a man could sit that still for that long. Now I think I might have. Rowan said nothing. She had found that silence was often the right response to things that had been carried a long time. Everett cleared his throat. "There's dry wood in the box on the dock if that stove works. Loretta, that's my wife. She runs the diner on Millbrook Street. Tell her I sent you, and she'll charge you less than she should." He looked at Rex, who had not moved from his position beside the hatch. Storm should pass by morning. He left then, footsteps careful on the wet dock, and Rowan heard the marina office door close against the wind. She was alone with Rex and the lantern and the rain. She pulled the photograph from the wall carefully and held it closer to the light. The young man in it had the lean that came from working rather than training, the build of someone who had been doing physical things for years rather than preparing to. His expression was not quite a smile, more like the beginning of one that something had interrupted. On the back of the photograph, written in ink that had faded but remained legible, "Korea, 1952, Cole and Dolphin." Rowan pinned it back to the wall. She sat on the edge of the bunk and pulled one of the composition notebooks from the shelf. The cover was water-stained and soft with age. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting inside was careful and even. Small letters, consistent spacing. The handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship when that was still considered important and had maintained the habit. January 9th, 1961. Arrived at Millhaven Bend Marina. Took the end slip. Everett Dooley's father runs the place. Good man. Doesn't ask questions. The river here is wide enough that you can lose yourself watching it. That is what I need. Dolphin seems to approve of the water, though he prefers the dock to the boat. We'll have to negotiate. Rowan read 3 more entries. December cold. River frozen along the north bank. Dolphin in the business of maintenance, and the price of fuel, and the specific quality of silence on a winter river that was different from the silence of summer. Cole Mercer wrote about silence the way some men wrote about weather, with precision and without sentiment, as a thing that had properties and could be measured. Then Rowan read this. March 3rd, 1961. The noise in my head is quieter near the water. I do not know why this is. On land, in town, inside buildings with walls that do not move, the noise is continuous. Here it recedes, not gone. It does not go, but receded the way a tide recedes, and in the space it leaves I can sometimes think. Rowan set the notebook down on the bunk beside her. Outside, the storm rolled through the marina in long waves of sound and pressure, and the river Judas moved beneath it with the patient, practiced endurance of something that had survived many storms by not fighting them, by yielding just enough and holding in the places that mattered. Rex lay down beside the hatch. He stretched his damaged leg carefully out to the side, lowering himself with the deliberate care of an animal that had learned how to manage its own pain without assistance. He rested his chin on the floor directly above the hatch cover and closed his eyes. But his ears did not stop moving. Rowan watched him and thought about what it meant that a dog who had smelled explosives across 3 countries and cleared buildings where armed men waited in the dark was lying with his chin pressed to this particular section of floor in this abandoned houseboat in a small Arkansas town at the edge of the Ozark Hills. She thought about this for a while. Then she reached into her pack and pulled out the thin blanket she had carried since Fayetteville and lay down on the bunk without removing her boots. The kerosene lantern threw soft, warm light against the steel walls. The rain on the roof was steady now, no longer surging, settled into the long, patient rhythm of an Ozark rain that had decided to stay. Rowan closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She had not truly slept in years, not the way she understood sleep to have once worked, deep and restorative and unguarded. What she did instead was a version of rest her body had negotiated with her mind over many years, a partial lowering of vigilance that allowed some physical recovery while keeping enough of her active to respond to sounds. The storm moved through in stages. First the heavy rain, then a period of violent gusting that shook the cabin walls and sent something unsecured rolling across the deck outside. Then a longer quiet, then more rain, lighter this time, more resigned. Somewhere in the second hour, 3 sounds came from beneath the floor. Knock, knock, knock. Rowan was upright before she was fully conscious of moving, her hand reaching for a weapon that was no longer there, her body already in the doorway posture, weight forward, oriented toward threat. Rex was on his feet in the same instant, facing the hatch. Then silence. Only rain. Only the river working against the hull in its slow, repetitive way. Only the creak of dock lines taking the weight of the current. Rowan stood in the center of the cabin with her pulse loud in her ears and her hands open at her sides, scanning the room in the careful pattern she could not stop doing, and she recognized after a moment that the sounds had been structural. The storm surged, pushing the hull sideways against the pilings, pressure building to the point of percussion, releasing in 3 distinct impacts that her resting mind had translated into deliberate knocking. She recognized this. She had not been resting deeply enough to mistake sounds this badly in several years. She sat down slowly on the edge of the bunk and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed with intention until her pulse returned to something workable. Rex came to her then, not barking, not agitated. The dog pressed his head against her knee and stood there while her hands found the familiar geography of his ears and skull and jaw, and the simple physical fact of the animal, warm and present and real, did what it had always done in the years since Afghanistan. It brought her back. They sat like that for a while in the lantern light, while the rain gentled further and the river moved past them in the darkness outside, patient and indifferent and continuous. Eventually, Rowan reached for the composition notebook again. She read until the lantern dimmed and she trimmed the wick and read more. Cole Mercer wrote about the river through every season. He wrote about fish and weather and the changing light on the water at different hours. He wrote about the other men who kept boats in the marina, their habits and their stories, described with affection but stripped of sentiment. He wrote about his dog with a specificity that Rowan recognized as the way people wrote about what they trusted most. And periodically, between entries about tides and temperatures and the mechanical necessities of keeping an old boat floating, Cole Mercer wrote a few lines about what it was like inside his own head, and those lines landed on Rowan the way a hand placed carefully on a bruise lands. The noise does not leave. But you learn to live beside it rather than inside it, the way you learn to live beside a river instead of trying to stop it. Rowan set the notebook down when morning light began to gray the windows. Rex was already awake, standing at the cabin door with quiet expectation. Rowan opened it, and they stepped out onto the deck together into air that smelled of rain and pine and the cold, particular clarity that follows a storm. The marina was damaged but intact. Flood debris had washed against the dock pilings overnight. One empty slip had broken loose entirely, its dock section floating sideways against the shore. But the River Judas had held to its mooring lines, and the sky above the Ozark ridgeline was showing the first pale suggestion of clearing. Everett Dooley appeared from the marina office carrying a thermos and wearing the same jacket as the night before, which suggested he had slept in it or had not slept at all. "Still alive," he said. "More or less," Rowan said. Everett handed her a paper cup of coffee from the thermos. They stood together on the dock for a moment, looking at the storm damage without speaking, which was the appropriate response to storm damage in the experience of people who had seen worse. Then a truck pulled into the marina parking lot. A dark green Ford F-25. Oh, well-maintained, cleaner than anything else in the parking lot. It stopped near the office. A man got out. He was perhaps 46 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a thick beard maintained with more attention than he probably wanted to advertise. He wore a camouflage jacket and boots that were expensive. He moved like a man accustomed to walking into situations he expected to control. His eyes went to the River Judas immediately. Then they went to Rowan. Everett's expression shifted in a way that was small but unmistakable. "Morning, Garrett," he said. The man named Garrett Slade looked at Rowan with the direct assessment of someone who had decided in the first 2 seconds whether a person was an obstacle or an irrelevance. "You buy the boat," he said. Not a question. "Yesterday," Rowan said. Something moved in Garrett Slade's expression. Not anger exactly. Something more controlled than anger. "I made an offer on that boat 6 months ago," he said, after Cole passed. Everett here wasn't interested in doing business. He said it with the smoothness of a man who said things in ways that were technically accurate while meaning something else. Everett said nothing. Garrett looked back at the River Judas. Rex was standing on the deck. The dog had not barked. He was simply standing, watching Garrett Slade with the calm, settled attention that in Rowan's experience meant the dog had already formed an opinion, and the opinion was not favorable. "Cole Mercer was a complicated man," Garrett said conversationally. "People around here remember him as a harmless old veteran on a boat." He smiled. He was more than that. Rowan held her coffee cup and said nothing. Garrett Slade's eyes dropped for just a moment to the deckboards of the River Judas, and in that moment his expression was unguarded in a way the rest of his manner had not been. There was something in his face that Rowan recognized from years of reading people in difficult circumstances. Not greed exactly, something older than greed and mixed with other things. He recovered quickly. "Well," he said, putting the casual back into his voice. "Small town. I'm sure I'll see you around." He nodded at Everett, looked once more at the boat, and walked back to his truck. The engine started. The truck pulled out without hurrying. Rowan watched it go. "Trouble," Everett said quietly. "I gathered that," Rowan said. "What does he want with the boat?" Everett was quiet for a moment in the way of a man deciding how much to say and to whom. "That's a conversation for a different time," he said finally. "Right now I've got dock damage to assess, and you've probably got a bilge full of water that won't pump itself." He walked away toward the collapsed dock section, and Rowan stood with her coffee and watched the empty road where Garrett Slade's truck had been. Rex came to stand beside her on the dock, shoulder against her leg. The dog looked up at her once, then looked back toward the road. Rowan looked down at him. "I know," she said quietly. She finished her coffee and went to find the bilge pump. It took most of the morning to get it working and most of the afternoon to pump the bilge down to a manageable level. The water that came out was black and smelled of river bottom and whatever had been sitting in it for the better part of a year. Everett found her a second hose and an extension cord that reached from the marina office with enough length to spare, and by mid-afternoon, the pump was running steadily and the River Judas was riding 3 inches higher in the water than it had that morning. Rowan worked without stopping. It felt better than not working. The physical rhythm of managing the pump, checking connections, monitoring the output. These were things with clear parameters and measurable progress, and her mind settled into the work the way it settled into nothing else. Rex supervised from the dock. As the bilge level dropped, Rowan crouched with a flashlight through the hatch access points along the cabin wall, watching the water recede from the steel ribs of the hull, watching the lower compartment emerge from the dark water inch by inch, and watching something else emerge with it. In the deepest section of the bilge space, beneath the floor joists and well above the lowest hull plating, someone had built a platform. Wooden boards, pressure-treated, elevated 6 inches above the bilge floor on short steel legs bolted through the hull framing. The construction was deliberate and careful, military careful, the kind of careful that thought about moisture and access and concealment all at once. On the platform, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the water out, something large and rectangular sat in the receding dark. Rowan held the flashlight steady and looked at it for a long time. Rex appeared above her at the hatch opening. The dog lowered his nose toward the rising smell of old metal and oil, and something else, something that had been sealed away for a long time and was now slowly becoming findable again. Rex made a sound that Rowan had not heard from him in years. It was not a bark, it was not a growl. It was the sound the dog made when he had found what he was looking for and was waiting for Rowan to catch up. Outside, the afternoon light was going amber over the river, and Millhaven Bend was settling into the quiet of a weekday evening, and somewhere down the Marina Road, an engine that might have been a dark green F-25 idled briefly before moving away. Rowan stayed crouched at the hatch opening with the flashlight and looked at the platform and the bilge and the thing resting on it, and she did not reach for it yet. She had learned in places that were nothing like this that the moment before you understood something was the last moment you had to prepare for what understanding it would cost you. She let the moment last a little longer. Then she straightened up, went out to check on Rex, and stood for a while on the deck of the River Judas, watching the white river move past in the failing light, broad and dark and carrying everything downstream with the perfect indifference of water that had been doing this long before any of them arrived and would be doing it long after. Stay with us, because what Rowan finds inside that trunk is not treasure. It is the truth about what one broken soldier chose to do with 60 years of survival. And it will change the way you think about the men who came home and never quite said so. The morning after the storm came in, pale and cold. The kind of October morning that felt like a warning about what was coming rather than a continuation of what had been. Rowan was already awake when the light arrived. She had been awake most of the night, which was not unusual, reading Cole Mercer's notebooks by the kerosene lantern, while Rex slept in his careful way beside the hatch, one ear always partially raised, always listening even in rest. She had read 4 notebooks through to the end. She had started a 5th. Cole Mercer had been a precise and consistent writer. He did not dramatize. He did not editorialize. He recorded what happened and what he observed, and occasionally, in the way of a man who had no one to say things to and had found a partial solution in paper, he wrote what he felt. These passages were shorter than the others and more carefully worded, as though he understood that feeling required more precision than fact and had allocated his language accordingly. The bilge pump was still running. Rowan went outside in the early light and checked it, then walked the dock in the cold morning air while Rex moved ahead of her, nose working across the wet planking, cataloging everything the storm had deposited overnight. The marina looked ragged in daylight. Debris had settled against every piling. The collapsed slip section had drifted further along the shore. Somewhere in the night, a cleat had pulled free from the main dock and taken a section of railing with it, leaving a gap that Rowan noted and stepped around without thinking about it. She stood at the end of the dock and looked at the river. The white river after a storm was a different color than it was otherwise, darker, carrying more of the hills in it, the red clay and pine duff and leaf matter of the Ozark watershed moving through in suspension. It would clear in a few days. She did not know how she knew this about a river she had never seen before, but she knew it the way you knew things that came from paying close attention to similar things for a long time. Rex came to stand beside her. They stood there together for a while without any particular purpose, which was itself unusual enough to notice. Everett Dooley arrived at the marina around 7:30 with coffee in a thermos and a paper bag from the diner that contained biscuits wrapped in wax paper. He handed these to Rowan and looked at the dock damage with the expression of a man adding figures in his head and not enjoying the sum. "Loretta sends those," he said about the biscuits. She heard there was someone on the old boat. News travels, Rowan said. In Millhaven Bend, it travels before things actually happen, Everett said. It's a gift and a problem depending on the situation. They drank coffee and Rowan ate one of the biscuits, which was better than anything she had eaten in several weeks, and they looked at the river and did not say much, which suited them both. The bilge is down enough, Rowan said finally. I need to get into the compartment. Everett looked at her over his coffee cup. What compartment? Below the floor. Someone built a storage platform down there. Whatever's on it has been wrapped in oilcloth and sitting above the waterline. Rowan paused. It was built that way on purpose. Everett was quiet for a moment. Coal, he said. Just the one word with a quality that was statement and question and the beginning of an understanding all at once. I think so, Rowan said. Everett looked at his coffee cup, then at the boat. You find anything else in those notebooks of his? Rowan considered how much to say. Enough to know he was more careful about things than most people. Everett made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. That is, he said, one way to put it. He did not say anything else and Rowan did not push him, and they finished the coffee while the morning light strengthened over the Ozark Hills and the river continued its business of moving everything downstream. Getting into the compartment properly required removing the false floor section first, which required tools Rowan did not have. Everett produced a pry bar and a wooden mallet from the marina workshop without being asked, which suggested he had been thinking about this since Rowan mentioned it. The false section came up after some persuasion. Whoever had installed it had done the job with the specific intention that it not come up easily, the planks cut to fit exactly and seated on a frame of their own that dropped into the original hatch opening. It had been in place long enough that the wood had swollen tight to the surrounding floor, making the seams nearly invisible even up close. When it came free, the smell that rose from beneath was cold and metallic and old. Not unpleasant. The smell of things that had been sealed carefully and had remained what they were. Rex moved to the edge of the opening immediately. His nostrils worked in rapid, careful pulses. His tail did not move. His posture was that of a dog who had been right about something and was now waiting for the human to confirm it. Rowan lowered herself through the opening with the flashlight. The bilge space was narrow, but not impossibly so, the kind of space a woman could work in if she was deliberate about it. The platform was exactly as she had seen it from above. Solid construction, bolted properly, the legs through bolted to the hull framing rather than simply resting on it. Someone had thought about what would happen if the boat rolled significantly or took on water rapidly. They had engineered against those possibilities. The oilcloth wrapping was thick military canvas, the kind that came on rolls from surplus suppliers, treated with linseed oil to shed water. It had been wrapped in overlapping layers and secured with cord that had gone stiff with age, but had not deteriorated. Rowan cut it with her folding knife, unwrapping carefully, not knowing what she was unwrapping and proceeding accordingly. What emerged was a military storage trunk. Steel construction, olive drab paint worn through to bare metal at the corners and edges, approximately 4 feet long and 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep. The hinges and hasp were brass, green with oxidation, but structurally sound. Along the top surface, stenciled in black paint that had faded but remained legible, U.S. Navy 1953. Rowan crouched over it for a moment without opening it. Beside it on the platform sat 3 cylindrical containers, the kind used for documents or instruments, each sealed with threaded caps and military specification gaskets designed to exclude moisture. These were newer than the trunk, perhaps 1970s vintage. Each one had been wrapped separately in additional oilcloth. There was no lock on the trunk hasp, no padlock, no wired seal, nothing to prevent opening. Cole Mercer had relied on concealment rather than physical security, which meant that whoever found this was supposed to open it. Rowan lifted the hasp and opened the lid. The hinges moved with surprising smoothness, suggesting they had been lubricated not long before Cole stopped being able to lubricate them. Inside, organized with the same careful deliberateness that characterized everything else about this man's approach to things, was the accumulated documentation of a life. Composition notebooks, these older and more worn than the ones on the shelf above. Photographs sorted into envelopes marked by decade. A canvas bag that clinked with the sound of metal on metal and proved to contain silver coins, Morgan dollars and peace dollars, and a few older ones that Rowan did not immediately identify, all cleaned and wrapped in cloth individually. Bundles of cash, bills held with rubber bands so old they crumbled at her touch and fell away, the bills themselves ranging from 50s to hundreds, old series, still crisp from having been stored dry, military decorations in a wooden box lined with faded velvet, a folded American flag, and a smaller wooden box that contained, when opened, a collection of envelopes tied together with ribbon that had once been blue and had faded to the color of old sky. The envelopes were addressed, dozens of them, each bearing a name and an address. Some of the addresses were local, Millhaven Bend and the surrounding area. Others were from across the country, addresses in Georgia, in Ohio, in California, and places between. None of them had been mailed. Rowan lifted the top envelope carefully. The name on it was Mrs. Vera Holloway, with an address on Route 9 outside Millhaven Bend. She looked at it for a long time without opening it. Then she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, and inside the fold were $300 bills so new and crisp that they seemed impossible given how long they had been sitting here. The letter was handwritten in Cole Mercer's precise small script. Mrs. Holloway, your husband saved my life twice before he lost his own. I was there in the valley when it happened, and I have thought about it most days since. This money is not what his service was worth, and I know it. But I am an old man, and I have been holding it for a long time, and I think you should have it now. Please do not try to find out who sent it. Some things are easier carried when they have no name attached. Rowan read the letter twice. Then she sat down on the bilge platform with her back against the hull ribs and held the letter in both hands and looked at it. Above her, through the open hatch, Rex appeared, looking down at her with patient amber eyes. After a while, Rowan climbed back out. Everett was sitting in the rusted chair by the window, the chair that had been Cole Mercer's chair, and Rowan thought she should mention that but decided against it. The old marina owner was looking at the river through the filmed window with an expression that suggested he had been sitting quietly with something for a while. Rowan set the letter on the counter and slid it toward him. Everett read it. He read it again. He set it down and looked at it without touching it further. Lord have mercy, he said softly. There are more, Rowan said. Dozens, all addressed, none of them mailed, each one with money inside. Everett was quiet for a long moment. He was fishing commercially into his 60s, he said finally. The voice of a man assembling something he had known the pieces of without seeing the shape. Made decent money at it, lived on almost nothing. He paused. I always wondered where the money went. Nobody ever saw him spend it on anything. He spent it on other people, Rowan said, anonymously, for 60 years. Everett looked at the window. His jaw moved once. There were notebooks in the trunk as well. Older ones. Rowan had brought two up and set them on the bunk. She opened the first one now and found what she was looking for within the first few pages, written in the same careful hand but younger, the letters slightly larger, the pen pressure heavier. January 1954. Home from Korea, 14 months. I use the word home loosely. The apartment is a place I sleep. The noise in my head makes it difficult to be in rooms where other people's noise is also happening. At night, I check the windows. This is not voluntary. I have tried to stop and I cannot stop it. Dolphin sleeps beside the door with his nose pointed toward the hallway, which helps more than it should. Rowan read this to Everett. The old man listened without moving. Then Rowan read another passage from a notebook dated 1961, shortly after Cole arrived at the marina. The river is the first place since before Korea where the noise is manageable. I do not understand the mechanism, but I have stopped needing to. Dolphin approves of the water. We watch it together in the mornings, and it is almost enough. Almost, Everett said quietly. That word does a lot of work. Rowan nodded. She thought about the word almost and what it contained, and how much of a life could be built in the space of it. Almost enough. Almost peace. Almost home. How people like Cole Mercer and people like herself had learned to construct a life in that gap, and sometimes to mistake the gap for the thing itself. She was still thinking about this when Rex's head came up sharply. The dog turned toward the cabin door. His ears went forward and his posture changed in the way that it changed when something had entered the perimeter that required evaluation. Not a threat necessarily, an unknown. which in Rex's framework was handled identically to a threat until proven otherwise. Footsteps on the dock, deliberate and unhurried. Rowan was standing before she was conscious of deciding to stand, moving to the side of the door frame rather than directly behind it, positioning from old training that happened below the level of thought. The door opened. Garrett Slade filled the frame. He had not knocked. He looked around the cabin with the quick, comprehensive scan of a man assessing a situation, taking in the open hatch, the notebooks on the bunk, the letters still on the counter, and Rowan standing to the side of the door. Rex moved between Garrett and Rowan. The dog did not bark. He stood with his weight slightly forward and his head lowered and his eyes on Garrett Slade with an attention so complete and so still that it was more unnerving than noise would have been. "I heard the pump running," Garrett said. "Figured you'd gotten into the bilge." Rowan said nothing. Garrett looked at the open hatch in the floor. His expression was controlled in the way that expressions were controlled when the thing underneath them was working hard. "Cole Mercer was careful with his things," Garrett said. "He let that sit for a moment. I knew him. Not well, but I knew him. My father knew him better." Everett stood from the chair and moved to stand beside the counter, which put him closer to Rowan without being obvious about it. His hands were loose at his sides. "Your father and Cole had a relationship," Everett said. His voice was careful and uninflected. "Something like that," Garrett said. He looked at the letter on the counter and his eyes stopped there with a fixed quality of attention. He did not reach for it. "What did you find in there?" "Notebooks," Rowan said. "Photographs." Garrett nodded as though this confirmed something. "Cole kept records of things," he said. "Transactions, communications, things that might look a certain way depending on how you read them." He paused. "I'd like the opportunity to go through what's there, given my family's connection to him." Rex took one step forward. Garrett looked at the dog. "You'll want to keep him back," he said. "He stays where he decides to stay," Rowan said. The two looked at each other. Garrett Slade had the eyes of someone accustomed to getting to the end of situations by applying steady pressure until the other party moved. Rowan had the eyes of someone who had been in situations where moving was not an option. After a moment, Garrett looked away first. "I'll be around," he said, "when you've had a chance to think about a fair arrangement." He looked once more at the open hatch and then at the letter on the counter. "There are things in there that belong to my family. I think you'll find that's true." He left the way he had come, the dock boards registering his steps moving away, the parking lot registering his engine starting, and then the particular silence of after. "What did he mean about his family?" Rowan said. Everett sat back down in the chair. He was quiet long enough that Rowan understood the answer was going to be complicated. "His father's name was Harold Slade," Everett said finally. "He was a fisherman here, had some good years and some bad ones. '89 was a bad one. The flooding that year took out his equipment, his boat, most of what he owned. He was facing losing everything. And then he didn't." Rowan waited. "Money appeared," Everett said. "Anonymous. Enough to cover what he owed and get back on the water. Harold spent 30 years wondering where it came from. Died in 2019 still wondering." His voice was flat and precise. "Cole Mercer's name was in the conversation a few times over those years, but nobody ever confirmed anything. And Cole never said a word." Rowan looked at the bundle of envelopes on the counter. "Is there a letter for Harold Slade in there?" "I don't know yet," Everett said, "but I think you probably do." Rowan went through the bundle carefully. There were 43 envelopes in total, each one addressed in Cole's precise hand, each one sealed, none of them mailed. She found the one addressed to Harold Slade approximately halfway through the stack. She held it without opening it for a moment. "If this says what I think it says," she said, "then Garrett Slade's version of his family history has a problem," Everett said. Rowan set the envelope aside separately from the others. She spent the rest of the morning reading notebooks. Rex moved between the hatch and the door in a pattern that gradually became less frequent as the morning wore on and no new threats materialized, settling eventually into his customary position with his back against the bunk and his eyes moving between Rowan and the door. The older notebooks told a different kind of story than the later ones. The 1950s and early 1960s entries were harder reading, not because Cole wrote dramatically about his time in Korea, but because he wrote with the flatness of someone who had concluded that feeling things deeply in writing was a form of indulgence he could not afford, which made the moments when feeling broke through more striking. March 1954. I drove past the Holloway farm today. The widow has put it up for sale. Two sons. The older one has his father's jaw. I did not stop. There was nothing I could have said that would have been worth the saying, but I have been thinking about what I can do instead of saying. April 1954. I am going to be more useful than I am comfortable being. This is the conclusion I have reached. Dolphin seems to agree. He has always had better judgment about these things. Rowan read this and sat with it. The structure of Cole Mercer's life, as it emerged through the notebooks, was not the structure of a man who had found peace. It was the structure of a man who had found something to do with the absence of peace, who had taken the fact of his own damage and the fact of other people's need and built from those two things a life that was not whole, but was, in its way, purposeful. He had been doing it for 60 years. In a notebook from 1989, the year of the Arkansas floods, Rowan found an entry dated September of that year. The Slade family lost most of what they had in the flooding along the lower river. Harold Slade is a proud man and will not take charity. He does not need to know it is charity. $3,000 will cover what he owes at the equipment co-op and leave enough to get the boat back in the water. I have written the letter, but I will not send it. A letter creates a connection, and a connection creates an obligation, and Harold Slade does not need my obligations. He needs to believe the world contains unexpected grace. I will provide the grace. The belief is his own business. Rowan read this entry to Everett. The old man sat in Cole's chair by the window and looked at the river for a long time afterward. "That man," he said finally, and then did not finish the sentence, because there was no ending for it that would have been adequate. Rowan agreed. She was still reading in the early afternoon when Loretta Dooley arrived at the marina with a covered pot of soup and a warmth that expressed itself through the immediate practical address of physical needs and did not discuss the expression of it afterward. She looked at the open hatch and the scattered notebooks, and Rex and Rowan, and asked no questions, which Rowan appreciated more than almost anything she could have said. She set the soup on the counter and looked at the envelopes. "Vera Holloway passed away in 2003, she said, touching the edge of the envelope addressed to Mrs. Vera Holloway with one finger. Her son Dale still farms the old property. He is 61 years old and has his father's jaw." She left shortly after, and Rowan thought about what it meant that Cole Mercer had known about that jaw and had driven past that farm and had written that letter and sealed it and kept it for decades without sending it. She ate the soup and continued reading. The afternoon was going toward evening when things changed. Rex heard it first. The dog came to his feet from a dead rest with a speed that always surprised people who assumed an old injured animal would be slow about it, turning toward the stern-facing cabin window with his body low and his movement intentional. 3 seconds later, Rowan heard footsteps on the rear dock section. Not Everett. Too light and too careful. Someone who did not want to be heard. Rowan moved to the side window and looked through the grime-film glass at the angle that gave her the best view of the rear dock without putting her in the sight line of anyone looking at the window. 2 men she had not seen before were crouched near the stern cleat, doing something with the mooring line. A third was standing at the end of the dock watching the marina road. Rex appeared beside her, looking up, reading her face for information. "Stay," Rowan said quietly. She went out through the cabin door fast and around the cabin exterior to the rear deck. The 2 men at the stern cleat stood immediately, but they were not ready for how fast the move had been, and they were not ready for Rex coming around the other side, which the dog did despite the stay command, because there were situations in which Rex's judgment superseded Rowan's instructions, and they both understood this. The men retreated to the dock. Rowan got a good look at their faces in the fading light. Neither was Garrett Slade. They were younger, harder-faced, men who did the physical work of other people's plans. One of them looked at Rex and made a decision. They both walked away quickly toward the parking lot, and Rowan heard a vehicle start somewhere beyond the marina entrance and pull away. She checked the stern cleat. The mooring line had been half sawed through, not cut clean, sawed the way you would do it if you wanted it to look like it had failed rather than been cut. If it had parted in the night with the current pulling on it, the River Judas would have drifted free of the dock and moved downstream, with everything in the bilge compartment still inside it. Rowan stood on the rear deck in the cold evening air and understood that the situation had moved to a different level than it had been this morning. Rex stood beside her, looking toward the parking lot where the vehicle had gone. Everett came over from the office and Rowan showed him the mooring line. He looked at it for a long time with the expression of a man who was angry but not surprised. He said a word under his breath that Rowan had not heard from anyone in some time. "That's Garrett's doing," Everett said. "Probably," Rowan said. "That man runs on entitlement," Everett said. "Thinks anything connected to his family's history belongs to him by right. His father was nothing like him. Harold was a proud man, difficult sometimes, but honest. He earned what he had and didn't expect more." "Does Garrett know about the money Cole gave his father?" Everett shook his head. Harold never knew where it came from. Garrett grew up with the family story that Harold had pulled himself back from the floods through his own effort. He believes it completely. It's the version of his father he's built his sense of himself on. "So if there's a letter in that trunk that tells a different story," Rowan said. Everett looked at her. "Then the story Garrett Slade has been telling himself for 35 years falls apart," Rowan said. They replaced the mooring line with a new one from the Marina workshop and added a second line from a different cleat, and Everett locked the marina gate before he left for the evening, and Rowan brought the kerosene lantern back to full brightness and sat at the table with Rex beside her and continued reading. The night came down fast and cold over Millhaven Bend. Around 9 o'clock, Rex's head came up. Not the slow, curious elevation that meant something interesting, the fast, locked attention that meant something specific. Rowan extinguished the lantern. Darkness swallowed the cabin. Through the cabin window on the marina side, she could see the glow of the sodium dock light, and beyond it the darker mass of the parking lot, and beyond that the road. A vehicle was idling somewhere at the road edge, headlights off. She could see the faint movement of exhaust in the cold air. Watching. It sat there for 4 minutes by Rowan's count. Then it moved away slowly without lights, which told her that whoever was driving knew these roads well enough to navigate them without assistance. She relit the lantern after another 5 minutes. Rex remained alert for another 10 minutes and then, gradually, settled. Rowan opened the cylindrical container she had brought up from the platform. The first two contained documents, service records, official correspondence from the Navy dating back to 1953, citation paperwork for decorations, discharge papers. Cole Mercer's official history, preserved with the same deliberate care as everything else. The third container was different. Inside it was a bundle of letters, these ones not in envelopes but folded and secured with a rubber band. Each one was addressed on the outside of the fold in Cole's handwriting. Not to strangers this time, to people he had known personally. Some of the names appeared in the notebooks, and at the bottom of the bundle, separate from the others, a letter in an envelope that was not addressed. The envelope was sealed. On the front, in Cole Mercer's handwriting, "For the man the river sends me." Rowan held it in both hands. Rex lifted his head and looked at her. She did not open it. Not yet. She set it carefully on the counter and looked at it for a moment, and then looked out the dark window at the river that she could not see but could hear, moving past in the darkness with its steady, purposeful sound, carrying everything downstream without prejudice or preference, the way it had been doing since long before Cole Mercer and long before Rowan Callum and long before any of the names in those envelopes. She read for another hour. She found entries in the notebooks about other men she recognized from the letters, lives Cole had watched and quietly influenced without involvement, without recognition, without the comfort of knowing whether his help had made any real difference, because he had built the help specifically so that he would never know. It was the loneliest kind of generosity Rowan had ever encountered, and she understood it completely. Because it was the kind of generosity that did not require the other person's participation, that did not require gratitude or acknowledgement or a relationship. You could do it from the outside, from the position of someone who could not quite make herself part of the world, but could still affect it from the edge. Cole Mercer had spent 60 years on the edge. Rowan knew the edge. She had been living on it so long she had stopped remembering there was anything further in. It was late, past midnight, when she heard the first sound from outside that was not wind or river or the normal settling of an old boat. It came from the direction of the fuel storage building at the far end of the marina, a sound like something falling, then nothing, then the climbing crackle of something that should not be burning. Rex was at the door before Rowan finished processing the sound. Rowan opened the door. Orange light was moving in the windows of the fuel storage building 40 yards up the dock. Not the orange of a work light, the irregular climbing orange of fire. For 1/2 second, Rowan stood completely still in the doorway, and her mind ran the assessment with the speed that it ran such assessments: threat type, size, spread rate, wind direction, likely points of origin, likely intent. Intent. This was not an accident. The fuel building was locked and had been dark all day, and the doors were closed and fire did not start. Enclosed locked buildings from nothing. This was a distraction. She spun back toward the stern of the boat and saw them. Two figures on the dock near the rear cleat, one already crouching with something in his hands, moving fast now that they had been seen. Rex launched off the deck before Rowan finished moving, covering the distance to the dock in 3 strides despite the damaged leg. The speed of it, something that people who had not seen a trained Malinois work always underestimated until they saw it. The man at the cleat saw Rex coming and made the sound that people made when they realized they had miscalculated something fundamentally. He threw himself sideways and Rex caught his jacket sleeve, and the momentum of both of them together hit the dock railing hard enough that the old wood cracked and gave partially. The second man had a length of steel pipe. He had been moving toward the cabin door, and he redirected when the situation changed and came around the stern toward Rex, who was occupied. Rowan was already moving. The pipe came down. It caught Rex across the ribs, and the sound of it did something to the inside of Rowan's chest that was different from anything combat had ever done to her. Rex went down on his side, a yelp that cut off immediately as the dog tried to rise again and could not. Rowan hit Garrett Slade's man with everything she had. She did not think about it. The part of her that thought had stepped aside, and the part of her that had spent years learning exactly how to stop people from hurting her team, had taken over completely. She put the man down in 4 seconds using methods she had not used in years, and found were entirely undiminished by the passage of time. The first man had freed himself from Rex and was running. Rowan let him run. She was already on the dock beside Rex. The dog was breathing. That was the first thing. Breathing and trying to get up, the front legs working and the back legs not cooperating, and the sound of each breath had something in it that made Rowan's hands move faster. "Easy," she said, her voice coming out lower than she intended, closer to something raw. "Easy, partner. I've got you." Rex stopped trying to rise. He looked at Rowan with the amber eyes, and his breathing was labored and shallow and too fast. Behind them, the fuel building was fully involved now, orange light pulsing across the marina, smoke beginning to pour from the roofline, and she heard Everett's voice from somewhere across the dock, shouting about the pump, and she heard sirens beginning far away in the direction of town. She heard none of this in any way that required response. She picked Rex up as carefully as she had ever done anything. The dog was 65 pounds, and Rowan had not carried 65 pounds of anything in years, but it did not register as weight. She carried Rex up the dock toward the parking lot, and she did not stop moving. Everett appeared out of the smoke with a fire extinguisher and stopped when he saw Rowan's face and Rex in her arms. "The truck," Rowan said. Everett did not ask questions. He was moving toward his truck before Rowan finished speaking, keys already out, and he had the engine running and the passenger door open by the time Rowan reached it with Rex. "There's a veterinary clinic," Everett said. "Mountain Home, an hour east." He was already moving. Rowan sat in the passenger seat with Rex across her lap, one hand against the dog's ribs, feeling each breath arrive and depart. And behind them, the marina was orange against the black October sky. And ahead of them, the highway ran east through the dark Ozark Hills towards something that had to be there, that had to be open, that had to be enough. Rex looked up at her once. "Just stay," Rowan said. Her voice was not steady. She did not try to make it steady. There was no one to perform steadiness for anymore. There was only this dog and this highway and the space between here and help. "You stay with me." Rex blinked once, slowly, and let his head rest against Rowan's leg with the full weight of an animal that has decided to trust completely. And the truck carried them both east through the darkness at the highest speed Everett Dooley had driven in 30 years. The clinic sign came into view at 11 past midnight, white and steady above the highway. Rowan was moving before the truck fully stopped. Rex in her arms, each breath the dog drew still shallow but present, still counting. A technician came through the front doors before Rowan reached them, moving with the efficiency of someone who had been called ahead and had used the time to prepare. Everett had called from the road, 40 minutes out, his voice on the phone carrying the compressed urgency that people who worked with animals recognized immediately. They took Rex from Rowan's arms at the door. She let them. That was the hardest physical act she had performed in years, opening her arms and stepping back, and the technician who took the dog was careful and competent, and Rowan could see that. And it did not make the stepping back easier by any measurable amount. A second technician led her to a waiting room. The waiting room was small and too bright and smelled of antiseptic and the clean animal smell of veterinary spaces. Plastic chairs lined two walls. A television mounted near the ceiling played a weather channel with the sound off, radar imagery moving across the screen in greens and yellows. A rack of brochures about heartworm prevention stood beside a water dispenser that made a sound every few minutes like something swallowing. Rowan sat down in one of the plastic chairs. Everett came in shortly after, having parked the truck, and took the chair beside her. The old man's jacket smelled of wood smoke from the marina fire. His hands rested on his knees, and he looked at the floor between his boots and did not try to fill the silence with anything. This was the right thing to do, and Rowan was grateful for it. She did not know how long they sat there. The weather radar moved through its cycles on the silent television. The water dispenser swallowed at intervals. Somewhere beyond the closed door at the far end of the room, people were working on Rex, and Rowan had nothing to do with any of that, which was a condition her entire system was poorly engineered to tolerate. She thought about Afghanistan, not the way she usually thought about it, with the involuntary quality of intrusion, sounds and light, and the physical memory of impact. She thought about it deliberately, the way you went back to something on purpose because there was information in it you needed. The compound outside a city she no longer named even in her own mind. The second floor giving way. The smoke and the screaming on the comms, and the moment of white when everything went silent and wrong simultaneously. Waking under concrete with her left arm not working, and blood on her face and the building still falling around her in pieces. And then Rex. Through the smoke, through the gunfire that was still ongoing, through debris that was still shifting and settling. The dog had come through all of it without any reason to expect to survive the attempt, and had found her in the dark and had closed his teeth gently around the harness strap and had pulled. 65 pounds of animal dragging 170 pounds of unconscious woman through concrete and smoke and fire. Rex had taken shrapnel in the extraction. 3 pieces, 2 superficial, 1 that required surgery, and had left the scar tissue that Rowan could feel under her fingers when she ran her hand along the dog's ribs, which she had done 10,000 times in the years since. The same ribs that a steel pipe had come down on tonight. Rowan pressed her hands flat on her knees and looked at the opposite wall and breathed with intention. Everett said quietly without looking up from the floor, "He's going to be all right." Rowan did not respond. Everett said, "I've been around working dogs my whole life. Dogs built like that don't give up from one hit. They're not made that way." Rowan knew this was true. She also knew that Rex was 9 years old, and that 9 years was old, and that the shrapnel injury had changed the architecture of his ribs in ways that made new damage to that area more consequential than it would have been otherwise. She knew all of this, and she set it aside because there was nothing useful in it right now. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the notebook she had put there before leaving the boat, one of the older ones, 1961. She opened it and read in the waiting room light, Cole Mercer's voice in the careful small script. February 1961. Cold on the river. Ice along the north bank this morning. Dolphin refused to leave the dock until the sun was fully up. Smart dog. He reads the temperature better than any instrument I own. I have been thinking about what it means to find a place and stay in it. All my life I have been told that restlessness is a flaw. I am beginning to think it might be a symptom rather than a character defect. The river does not judge restlessness. It is itself restless, and it does not apologize for it. Rowan read this twice, then she turned pages. June 1965. A man from the VA came to see me at the marina today. They have programs now, he said. Groups where veterans can talk about their experiences. I thanked him and he left, and I sat in my chair and watched the river for an hour. I do not need to talk about my experiences. I need to understand what to do with them. Those are different problems, and they require different solutions. Rowan thought about this for a while. The door at the far end of the waiting room opened, and a woman in surgical scrubs came out, late 30s, with the tired, competent face of someone who had been working for several hours and had more work to do. She looked at Rowan and at Everett and came directly to them. Two cracked ribs, she said. One of them shifted during transport, but it did not compromise the lung. She paused, reading Rowan's face with the attention of a person who had delivered a great deal of news in waiting rooms and had learned to calibrate accordingly. He's stable. He's awake and asking for you, in the way dogs ask for things. Rowan stood. He's got old injuries in that area, the veterinarian continued. Scar tissue from something previous. Looks like shrapnel. She said it without making it a question, which Rowan appreciated. The new damage complicated things because of the existing structure. She met Rowan's eyes directly. He needs real rest, not modified activity. Rest. 3 weeks minimum before anything that puts stress on that chest wall. Rowan nodded. She held Rowan's gaze for a moment longer. He's a remarkable animal, she said. Whatever he's been through, he's built up a tolerance for pain that I don't see often. She said it as a statement of fact, and also, underneath the fact, as something else. Something that acknowledged what it meant to have an animal that had learned to absorb that much and keep moving. That's not always easy to witness. Rowan said no, it isn't. She led her back through the door. Rex was on a padded surface in a room that smelled of antiseptic and warm air, wrapped in a blanket that left his head free, an IV line taped to his front leg with meticulous care. His eyes were open, and they found Rowan the moment she came through the door with the directness of something that had been waiting for exactly that. Rowan crouched beside him on the floor. She put her hand on the side of Rex's face and held it there, and Rex pushed back against her palm with the small available strength of an animal that was working hard and had less to work with than usual. Hey, Rowan said. Her voice came out wrong. She did not try to correct it. Rex's tail moved once against the blanket. You did what you always do, Rowan said. She was not thinking about whether to say this or how it sounded. She was just saying it. You put yourself between me and the thing. You've been doing that since Kandahar. She paused. I need you to stop doing it for a while. She put her forehead down against the dog's and stayed there. Just for a while. Rex breathed. Rowan stayed on the floor beside him until the dog's eyes closed, and his breathing evened into something that sounded less like effort and more like rest. And then she sat back against the wall and stayed there. Not sleeping, not reading, just present in the way that the dog had been present for her through every bad night of the last 9 years. Everett found a chair somewhere and brought it to the doorway of the room and dozed in the way of old men who had learned to sleep in uncomfortable places because life had required it of them. The night passed. Toward 4 in the morning, in the deep silence of that hour that had no parallel in any other part of the day, Rowan opened the notebook again. She found the page she was looking for without searching, as though she had known it was there. October 1989. Harold Slade lost his boat and most of his equipment to the September flooding. I have been watching the situation for 3 weeks. He will not ask for help. He is the kind of man who would rather fail entirely than accept charity, and I respect this even as I find it impractical. The money I'm going to send him is not charity. It is a correction of an imbalance that he does not know exists. He does not need to know. The balance matters. The knowledge of it does not. Then below that, a few lines added in slightly different ink, as though written later on the same day. I have been thinking about why I do these things in secret. Part of it is practical. People who know they have been helped feel differently about themselves than people who simply find that the world has, unexpectedly, been adequate. But part of it, and I will be honest with myself here because there is no one else to be honest with, part of it is that I cannot bear the relationship. I cannot sustain the connection that gratitude would create. I can give from a distance. I cannot receive at any distance. This is a limitation I have made my peace with. Rowan sat with this for a long time. She was still sitting with it when the first gray light came through the small window of the recovery room, and Rex opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression that contained, as clearly as any expression she had ever read, the simple information that the dog had made it through the night and expected her to acknowledge this appropriately. Good morning, Rowan said. Rex's tail moved twice. Everett drove them back to Millhaven Bend in the early morning. Rex wrapped in the borrowed blanket across Rowan's lap in the passenger seat, the Ozark Hills going from gray to gold as the sun came up over the ridgeline and the October light fell across the wet pavement of the highway and the river appeared beside the road, broad and silver in the morning. The marina had not burned down. The fuel storage building was a ruin of charred timber and melted metal fittings, still smelling strongly of accelerant and water and ash, but the dock and the boats in the River Judas had survived. Two volunteer fire department trucks sat in the parking lot, their crews moving through the debris in the methodical way of men doing an assessment rather than fighting anything active. A man from the fire marshal's office was there as well. He spoke to Everett for several minutes while Rowan sat on the dock with Rex, who was not supposed to walk more than necessary and had therefore been carried from the truck to the dock and was visibly unhappy about this, but enduring it. The fire marshal's man left after a while and Everett came to the dock. "Accelerant," he said. "Somebody poured something around the base of the building before they lit it." He looked at the ruin. Not subtle. They were in a hurry or they didn't care. "Garrett Slade," Rowan said. "I'd be surprised if it wasn't," Everett said. His voice had a quality past anger, which is the quality that precedes decision. "I've been in this town 67 years. I knew Harold Slade when he was a young man. I know what Cole Mercer did for people in this valley over 60 years, and I know he never once asked a single thing in return." He paused. "And I am not going to let his boat get burned or cut loose or picked over by a man like Garrett Slade." "What are you going to do?" Rowan said. He looked at her steadily. "What are we going to do," he said, "is a better question." Rex put his chin on Rowan's knee. Rowan looked at the river. She went back into the bilge compartment that afternoon, moving carefully so as not to disturb Rex, who had been settled on the bunk with the borrowed blanket and the instruction to stay, which the dog was following with the resigned dignity of someone who knew he had lost the argument before it started. The last cylindrical container was still sealed. She had left it the night before because something about it had seemed like it required a different moment. She understood this was not entirely rational. She opened it now. Inside, wrapped in the same oilcloth as everything else, were three items. The first was a folded document, legal-size paper, the kind used for formal instruments. She unfolded it carefully. A property deed. 12 acres along the White River, north of Millhaven Bend, including 3 cabin structures and a boat storage building, surveyed and recorded in 1987 with an Ozark County land record number along the top margin. The ownership line read, "Cole Mercer, with right of transfer to holder of this deed and associated journals upon death of grantor without surviving family." Rowan read this line twice. He had no surviving family, Cole had written in a 1991 notebook entry. His parents were gone. A brother lost in 1952. No wife, no children. The river had been his family, and the marina had been his home, and the people he had helped from a distance had been the closest thing to a community he could manage. The second item was a dog collar. Brown leather, tarnished brass hardware, worn soft with age and use. Stamped into the leather on the inside of the band. Dolphin USNK 91952 1966. Rowan held it in both hands. Rex, from the bunk, raised his head. Rowan brought the collar to him and held it near the dog's nose without touching him with it. Rex sniffed it with the focused attention of a dog processing something complex, something with layers. His ears went forward and then back and then forward again. His tail did not move. His eyes were serious in the way that dogs' eyes were serious when the information arriving was being taken seriously. After a moment, Rex put his head back down on the blanket, but his eyes remained open. "You smelled him that first night," Rowan said. "That's what you were telling me." Rex blinked once. The third item was the envelope she had set aside and not yet opened, the one addressed in Cole Mercer's handwriting. "For the man the river sends me." She opened it now. The letter inside was 3 pages, handwritten, the script slightly less even than the notebooks. The hand of an older man, but still legible, still precise, still Cole Mercer's voice in every line. "If you are reading this, then you found the boat and you opened what was underneath it, and you are probably sitting somewhere on the river trying to understand what any of it means. I will try to help with that, although I suspect you understand more of it than you think you do, or you would not have stayed. I stopped believing in coincidence sometime in the late 1960s, not because I became mystical about things, because I paid attention. The river does not send the same kind of person twice. The one it sends is always carrying something they do not know how to put down, and the boat gives them somewhere to put it, and then they understand why they came. I built the compartment under the floor in 1961, not to hide money, to keep things safe that deserve to be kept safe. The money came later when I had more of it than I needed, and other people needed it more than I did. I kept records because I am a man who keeps records. The letters I kept because I wrote them and could not send them and could not throw them away. Some things you make and cannot release and cannot destroy. You keep them and they keep you honest. The land on the North River is 12 acres and 3 cabins and a boat storage. I bought it in 1987 because I had the thought that a place like it should exist. Somewhere a person could go and not be asked to explain themselves, not be required to be well or functional or recovered, just to be in the way that the river is moving and not apologizing for it. I could not make it myself. I tried once, opened it to a few men I knew from the VA, and I found that I was not equipped to be the person at the center of a thing. I could give money and I could write letters and I could help from the outside. Being the person in the room where broken people gathered was beyond what I had to offer. The noise got too loud. You are a different kind of person. I know this because the dog is with you. Dogs choose their people, and they do not choose wrong. If he is with you, you have what I lacked. You can be in the room. You can stay. The property belongs to whoever holds the deed in the journals. That is you. What you do with it is yours to decide. I only ask one thing, and I ask it the way I have asked everything in my life, which is to say quietly and without expectation of compliance. Take care of the river. It has been taking care of us for a long time. Cole Mercer. Rowan set the letter down on the table. She sat in the cabin of the River Judas in the October afternoon light, and she looked at the river through the window that she had cleaned, the glass clear now for the first time in years, and the white river moved past outside in its broad silver way, carrying the light of the afternoon on its surface in broken moving pieces. Rex slept on the bunk behind her. She sat there for a long time. Then she got up and made the phone call she needed to make, which was to a lawyer in Mountain Home whose number Everett had given her that morning, and she explained the situation with the deed and the journals in plain factual terms, and the lawyer said the transfer language was enforceable and asked her to come in with the documents at her earliest convenience. Then she sat back down and looked at the river some more. Garrett Slade filed a claim on the 12 acres 8 days later. Rowan heard about it from Everett, who heard about it from the county records office, where a woman named Patty Doyle had worked for 31 years and noticed things. The claim alleged that Cole Mercer had entered into a verbal agreement with Harold Slade in 1989 to provide the 12 acres as compensation for services rendered, and that this agreement superseded any subsequent documentation. It was not a serious legal argument. The lawyer in Mountain Home, whose name was Aldrich Fenway, said so plainly. But it was the kind of argument that could require time and expense to resolve, and Rowan understood that time and expense were probably the point rather than the argument itself. Rex recovered steadily over the following weeks. By the second week, he could walk the dock without assistance, slowly with the careful deliberation of an animal that had made an accurate assessment of its own current limitations. He did not try to do more than he could do. He accepted the constraint with a dignity that Rowan found instructive. By the third week, something had begun to happen in Millhaven Bend that Rowan had not initiated and did not know how to stop. It started with Everett, who mentioned to 2 men at the VFW hall that there was a veteran on Cole Mercer's boat who had found something in the bilge worth knowing about. This was not specific, and it was not an invitation, but it resulted in 3 men appearing at the marina on a Tuesday morning with tools and no particular explanation. They looked at the dock damage from the storm and began repairing it without asking whether this was welcome. Rowan watched this from the deck of the River Judas. She did not tell them to stop. Loretta came the next day with 2 other women from her church and cleaned the inside of the 3 cabins on the 12-acre property, which Everett had driven her to see and which she had assessed with the practical eye of a woman who understood what a thing needed to become what it was supposed to be. By the end of the 3rd week, there were people coming and going from the marina and the river property in a pattern that Rowan had not designed and could not quite account for. And the cabins were clean and repaired, and the dock was solid, and the River Judas had new paint on its hull, navy blue, applied by a retired pipefitter named Douglas Crane, who showed up one morning with 3 gallons of marine paint and said he had time. Rowan worked alongside all of them. This was the only thing she knew how to do with it. Rex walked between the marina and the property on the days when the walking was manageable, and the people who came to work greeted the dog with the warmth that people extended to animals who had clearly been through something and were clearly still showing up. Rex accepted this with the reserved appreciation of an animal that understood its dignity and was not going to compromise it by being effusive about a chin scratch. The first veteran appeared on a Wednesday in early November. His name was Denton Pruitt, 61 years old, Army, 2 tours that he did not specify and Rowan did not ask about. He arrived in a pickup truck with a sleeping bag and a toolbox and the expression of a man who had been told there was a place but was prepared to find out there was not. Rowan showed him the first cabin. Denton looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he put his toolbox down inside the door and went to the river and stood there for a while, and Rowan left him to it and went back to the marina. Rex walked with Denton along the river that evening. Rowan watched from a distance. The dog moved beside the older man through the riverside grass, and Denton's posture changed over the course of the walk in a way that was subtle and specific, the shoulders dropping by degrees, the pace slowing from the pace of a man going somewhere to the pace of a man who was already there. 2 more men arrived in the following 2 weeks. Rowan did not advertise, did not explain, did not organize anything beyond making sure the cabins were warm and the river was accessible, and Rex was available to walk with whoever needed walking with. The legal matter with Garrett Slade resolved on a Thursday morning in the 4th week. Everett had arranged for the meeting to take place in the county land office conference room, a small room with fluorescent lights and a table that had seen better decades and 4 chairs. Present were Rowan, Everett, Aldrich Fenway, and a notary named Mrs. Brewster, who had been notarizing documents in Ozark County for 23 years. Garrett Slade arrived with a lawyer of his own, a younger man from Little Rock, who wore a suit more expensive than the room warranted and carried a briefcase with combination locks. Rowan put Cole Mercer's journals on the table. All of them. 41 composition notebooks arranged in chronological order, 1954 through 2022. She put the deed beside them. She put the letter for Harold Slade, still sealed, beside the deed. Garrett Slade looked at the letter with the fixed attention of a man who already knew what was in it without having opened it. His lawyer began to speak about the verbal agreement and the historical relationship between the Slade and Mercer families and the equitable considerations that any court would certainly recognize. Aldrich Fenway let him finish. Then he opened a notebook to a specific page he had marked and read aloud Cole Mercer's entry from October 1989, the one about Harold Slade and the flooding and the money and the correction of an imbalance. He read it in a flat, careful voice, the voice of a man reading a document rather than a personal record. The room was very quiet when he finished. Rowan looked at Garrett Slade. Garrett was looking at the sealed envelope with his father's name on it. His jaw was working slightly, a small movement barely visible. The movement of a man processing something that was arriving faster than he could organize a response to. "This is the letter that accompanied the money your father received in 1989, Aldrich Fenway said. "It was never sent. Cole Mercer retained it, as he retained all the letters he wrote. Ms. Callum has not opened it and has not read its contents. She is prepared to give it to you now, if you would like it." Garrett's lawyer started to say something about relevance. Garrett held up one hand. The lawyer stopped. Garrett looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he looked at Rowan. Rowan slid the envelope across the table. Garrett picked it up. He did not open it in the room. He held it with both hands and looked at it, and something moved across his face that was not the expression of a man who was losing a legal argument. It was something older and less organized than that. The expression of a man being shown something about his own history that restructured the history rather than simply adding to it. His father had not survived the floods through his own effort. His father had been helped by a man who asked nothing in return and left no trace of the helping, and had written a letter explaining it that had sat undelivered for 35 years. The story Garrett Slade had told himself about his father, about what his father had built, about what he himself had inherited, about the pride of it and the self-sufficiency of it, and the independence that he had held up as the defining characteristic of the Slade family. That story was not wrong exactly. It was incomplete. And the incompleteness was the difference between a man who had made it on his own and a man who had been quietly loved by a stranger at the moment he most needed it and never knew. Garrett's lawyer was looking at his client with the uncertain expression of a lawyer who understood that the meeting had moved somewhere outside his jurisdiction. Garrett stood up. He put the envelope in his inside jacket pocket. He looked at Rowan. "I'll withdraw the filing," he said. His voice was different than it had been. Flatter, quieter. Something had gone out of it. He walked out. His lawyer followed, the briefcase combination locks clicking softly in the quiet of the room. Aldrich Fenway looked at Rowan. "That was," he said carefully, "not the typical resolution of a land dispute." "No," Rowan agreed. "It was not." November deepened over Millhaven Bend in the way of Ozark Novembers. Cold and clear and smelling of wood smoke and pine, and the mineral coldness of river water when the temperature dropped. The leaves came off the cottonwoods along the marina in a week, leaving the branches bare against the pale sky, and the river went dark green and then dark gray as the light changed with the season. The River Judas sat in its slip with its new paint and its repaired roof and its cleaned windows, and on most mornings there was smoke from the small stove inside, which people in the marina had started to notice without commenting on because the noticing was sufficient. By mid-November, Rex had reclaimed his routines: the morning dock patrol, the afternoon walks along the river property, the one ear raised in sleep. Some things did not change and were not meant to. Rowan called Nora on a Thursday night in the third week of November. She had been thinking about calling for 2 weeks. She had picked up the phone 3 times and put it down. Not because she did not want to call, but because she did not know how to be what the call required her to be. Honest without burdening, present without demanding, in contact without making the contact about her own need for it. She called on a Thursday because Thursday had no particular significance, and she had decided that waiting for significance was another version of waiting for a condition that would never be fully met. The phone rang 4 times, then Nora's voice. She sounded the same and different, the way people sounded when time had moved through them and they had let it. Rowan had missed 3 years of whatever that movement had been. She knew this with a clarity that was not self-pity, but simple arithmetic. "Hey," Rowan said. A pause long enough that she felt the weight of everything that had made the pause necessary. "Mom." 1 word. Rowan held the phone and let it arrive. She told Nora about the boat. She told her about Rex and the bilge compartment and Cole Mercer's notebooks and the property north of the marina. She told it plainly, without embellishment, as a sequence of events that contained the meaning within them rather than attached to them. Nora listened. Rowan said, "I know I left." She paused. "I know that leaving looked like a choice from where you were standing." She looked out the cleaned window of the River Judas at the dark river moving past outside. Some of it was a choice. Some of it was not. "I'm not asking you to distinguish between those things. I'm just telling you where I am." Another silence. Then Nora said, "Is Rex okay?" "He's okay," Rowan said. Nora was quiet again, but differently quiet. "I have a son," she said. "You know that." "I know," Rowan said. "Cody, he's 8. "I know. He wants to go fishing," Nora said. "He talks about it constantly." Neither of those sentences was about fishing, and they both understood this. "There's good fishing on the White River," Rowan said. Her voice was careful, holding the words at the right weight, not too much and not too little. "If you ever wanted to see the river." The pause that followed was the kind that contained a decision being made. "Maybe in the spring," Nora said. Rowan said, "The river will be here." They talked for another hour, about Cody and about the town Nora lived in now, and about things that were not the important things, but were the path toward the important things. And when the call ended and Rowan set the phone down on the table, Rex came from the bunk and sat beside her and put his chin on her knee without being asked. Rowan put her hand on the dog's head. They sat like that while the stove ticked and the river moved outside, and Millhaven Bend settled into its Thursday night quiet. Nora and Cody came the first week of December. The drive from Nashville was 7 hours, and they arrived in the early afternoon when the winter light was still good over the hills, and the river was showing its winter color, deep gray-green and very clear. Rowan was on the dock when the car pulled into the marina parking lot. She watched Nora get out. She was 28 now. She had her father's way of standing and Rowan's eyes, which Rowan had always considered an unfortunate inheritance, and now reconsidered. The back door of the car opened, and a boy launched himself out before the car had fully stopped, dark-haired in a bright orange jacket, carrying a child's fishing rod that was slightly too long for him to manage gracefully. He stopped when he saw Rex. Rex was on the dock sitting, watching the boy with the careful assessment he applied to all new arrivals. The boy said very quietly, to no one in particular, "That dog is enormous." Rex's tail moved once. Cody walked toward the dock at the speed of a child who wants to run, and is exercising restraint he finds effortful. He stopped at the dock edge and looked at Rex, and Rex looked back at him with the serious amber eyes. "Is he friendly?" Cody asked. Rowan said, "He decides on a case-by-case basis." Cody considered this seriously. Rex stood, walked the 3 steps to Cody, and put his nose against the boy's hand. Cody went absolutely still with the instinctive understanding of a child who knew that this was a serious moment and should be treated accordingly. Then Rex pushed his nose harder into Cody's palm, which was as close to a formal approval as the dog offered, and Cody's face broke into an expression that Rowan was not prepared for, pure and uncomplicated and wholly itself. Nora stopped beside Rowan on the dock. She did not say anything for a moment. They watched Cody crouch down and tentatively touch Rex's ears, and Rex tolerate this with the patience of an animal that had decided to extend the approval to its full extent. "He looks like a good dog," Nora said. "He's the best dog," Rowan said. Her voice was not entirely steady. She did not try to make it so. Nora looked at the River Judas, at the new paint, the repaired roof, the cleaned windows with the warm light inside. At the dock, solid under their feet, rebuilt by people who had come without being asked. "You did all this," she said. "Had help," Rowan said. Nora looked at her then with the direct look she had inherited from her father, the look that saw things clearly and did not pretend otherwise. "You seem different," she said. Rowan thought about how to answer this. "I found something to do with what I was carrying," she said finally, "instead of just carrying it." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she put her hand through Rowan's arm the way she had not done since she was 12 years old, and they stood together on the dock while December light moved over the white river, and Cody introduced himself formally to Rex in full sentences, the way children talk to dogs they had decided to trust completely. That evening they built a fire in the pit at the river property and sat around it. Rowan and Nora and Cody and Everett and Loretta and Denton Pruitt and 2 other men who had been staying in the cabins. And the fire was a Rivertown fire, large and unhurried and useful rather than merely decorative. Cody fell asleep against Rex's side before 8 o'clock, his orange jacket pulled up around his ears, the dog warm and solid beside him, one ear still moving even in rest. Rowan looked at her daughter across the fire. Nora was looking at Cody and Rex together, and her face held the expression of a woman who had been worried about something for a long time and had arrived at the first evening in that time where the worry had receded enough to see past it. Rowan looked at the river. It moved past in the darkness beyond the firelight, broad and continuous, carrying the night downstream without effort, the way it had carried every night before this one, and would carry every night that followed. She thought about Cole Mercer sitting in his chair by the window every morning for 60 years, watching this same river carry the light on its surface and find it sufficient. She thought about what sufficient meant and what it required and what it did not require. Late that night, after Nora and Cody had gone to the cabin Everett had prepared for them, and after the fire had burned down to coals and the other men had drifted to their own spaces, Rowan walked back to the marina alone. Rex walked beside her, the limp manageable in the cold, the pace steady. She went aboard the River Judas and lit the kerosene lantern, though there was electricity now, because some habits were worth keeping. She opened the false floor section and crouched beside the compartment below. The trunk was there. The journals were there. The envelopes, resealed and ordered, were there. All of it exactly as Cole Mercer had arranged it. Rowan took 3 things from her jacket pocket. The first was Rex's old deployment collar from Afghanistan, the one she had kept in the bottom of her pack for 9 years without being able to explain why. Brown nylon, worn, the name tag scratched and dull. She set it in the compartment beside Dolphin's leather collar. The second was a silver dollar from Cole's collection, the one from 1921 that the coin dealer in Mountain Home had told her was the finest in the lot. She set it beside the collars. The third was an envelope. She had written it that morning, sitting at the table while Rex slept, and the winter light came through the clean window onto the river. She had taken 3 attempts to get it right and had burned the first 2 in the stove. On the front of the envelope, in her own handwriting, which was less careful than Cole Mercer's and more deliberate than it had once been. For the next person who thinks they're too broken to come home. She set it in the compartment. Then she closed the hatch and pressed it down until it seated, the wood settling back into the frame that had held it for 60 years. Rex was on the bunk, already settled, eyes half closed, one ear raised. Rowan sat down beside the stove in the warmth it made and looked around the cabin of the River Judas. At the wall she had repaired, in the window she had cleaned, in the shelf where Cole Mercer's notebook stood between their coffee cans full of river stones. She looked at the photograph on the wall, the young man squinting into the Korean sun beside the dog with the alert, intelligent eyes. Cole Mercer at 20 years old, before everything that had happened to him, already standing beside the animal that would carry him through it. Rowan looked at Rex. The dog opened one eye. "You picked a broken one," Rowan said. "Cole told me dogs don't choose wrong, so I figure that's your opinion to have." Rex's tail moved once against the bunk. Outside, the White River moved through the December night in its broad, unhurried way, carrying the cold and the dark downstream, carrying everything that the hills sent into it, carrying all of it south without judgment or preference, the way it had always done, the way it would keep doing long after the lantern in the old houseboat finally went dark. Rowan sat beside the stove and let the sound of it reach her. Just the river, just the boat, just the dog breathing steadily in the warm light. For the first time in more years than she could accurately count, that was enough. If you've ever had someone stay beside you when you gave them every reason to leave, man or dog, type yes in the comments. And if you believe that broken things can still find their way home, we'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Subscribe if stories like this one still mean something to you.